Hello and welcome to Unit 7, Imperial Measure and Measurement, your final unit. What's today's topic? Well, we're going to talk about imperial measure, and the goal is I want you to be able to explain why we need to understand imperial measure, and can you convert between units of measure within that system? So can you convert inside? So a little bit of an introduction here. You got a chart in front of you, and we just want to talk about making the comparison. So if I asked you how many ways or how do you measure mass in the metric system, you could tell me that we use kilograms, for example, tons for the farmers. You go to the scales at the elevators, they'll measure everything in tons. And some of you will be saying, oh, well, there's grams as well. So there is an imperial equivalence, all right? They're not the exact, and we're going to talk about how to calculate the exact in the next lesson. But kilograms is kind of the equivalent to pounds. So if you're measuring something in kilograms, you'd be measuring it in pounds if you're in the imperial system. They also have an imperial ton. Okay, and then if you're measuring something really small like grams, you're probably going to be measuring in ounces. Okay, so they have equivalent systems, and we're going to talk about how to, first of all, convert between the imperial and then go and cross the border. If I talk about volume, how do you measure volume? Most of you would measure in liters. Some of you would measure in milliliters, depending on how much fluid we're talking about. And some of you maybe will realize that cubic meters is also a measure. So there's a little bit more variety on the imperial side, the equivalent of liters, close to it anyway. And when I'm talking about equivalent, it would be what you'd be using on that side. So if you're measuring in liters, you're probably going to measure in gallons. Milliliters is going to be what we call fluid ounces. Okay, so the imperial, they have fluid ounces, which is a volume, and then they also have ounces, which is a mass. So it can be a little bit confusing when you're first starting into it. Cubic meters, you can have cubic feet, or you can have cubic yards. All right. So for people that order or have ordered gravel or work with construction, you'd order a cubic yard or a yard. You wouldn't even say the word cubic. In terms of length, how do we measure in Canada here? Well, you're probably, most of you are saying meters, centimeters. If it's really big, we measure kilometers. All right. If you're measuring in meters, you're talking about feet in the imperial system. Centimeters, you're going to measure in inches. Kilometers, you're going to measure in miles. All right. Now, the imperial have a couple other ones. You can measure in yards. Okay, which is kind of the equivalent to meters. It's kind of they end up having a little bit more variety because we usually stick with centimeters, meters, kilometers. We don't use decameters, which is kind of the equivalent of yards if we're trying to look for a comparison. So that gives you a feel for what we're working with. Now we're just working with imperial today, okay? So we're just going to be working with these guys today and so on and so forth. And we're talking about how to convert between. So we're not going to worry about bringing in the metric system right away. All right, so moving along here. Why do we have to understand the imperial system? Well, our official system here in Canada is metric. Okay, we use metric, and pretty much everywhere else in the world uses metric. The United States is our closest neighbor, and they're also our biggest trading partner. We trade large amounts of material with the US. Now, because all this material comes from the US, it is designed based on their measurement system, the imperial system. So I think pretty much everyone in the world except for the US and England, or the United Kingdom, those two countries still use imperial. Everyone else is metric, but because they're right next door to us, we have to understand the metrics or the imperial system. So it's very important, and that's why we need to know the imperial system. It's because as soon as you cross the border, you have to understand what the imperial system is. So let's talk about some imperial fractions. If I'm talking about measurement, imperial fractions, and for anyone who's taking a construction course or is in a construction course, we know that one of the smaller units of measure are the inches. Now the inches are broken down into what we would call the subsequent fractions, or the imperial fractions. So you can measure half inches, and little quotation marks, that represents or means inch. Okay, so the notation there That's our short form for inch. So a half inch, we do quarter inch. We can measure an eighth of an inch, and we can measure a 16th of an inch. And that's as low as we can really go here. Okay. Now, if I'm going to draw out a scale here, so you're going to have to pause the video once I get it up, and I want to show you where the different dashed or length of lines come from when you're looking at the imperial ruler. Okay, so I've wrote out all of the 16ths. So the smallest measure in the imperial system is the 16th that you can measure with a ruler. You have to go to calipers if you want to go smaller. I mean, you can go down to a 32nd or 64th of an inch, but you need a caliper. So on the ruler, they have 16ths. Now, you'll notice in the ruler down below here, okay, that these lines that we have, if you look at it, the imperial ruler has different length lines. All right, so why are these different length lines there? Well, that's what I want to talk about. So if we go back to my imperial measurements here, 1/16 I can't reduce, but I'm going to go and reduce all of the ones I can down to lowest terms. So 2/16 is the same as 1/8. 3/16 can't be reduced. 4/16 can be reduced to 2/8. 5/16 no. 3/8 no. And you see the pattern here. Every other one can be reduced, and the numerator is increasing by 1 each time. And 8/8. Okay. Now if I look at the eighths measurement here, I'm going to go through and reduce the ones that I can to lowest terms. So 1/8 doesn't reduce. 2/8 is a quarter. 3/8 no. 4/8 is 2/4. 5/8 no. 6/8 is 3/4. And the last one is 4/4. So I'm just reducing fractions to lowest terms. And finally, I'm going to reduce whatever I can to the lowest terms. And it turns out it's just a half and 1. So now if you look at these different measurements, or these, if I highlight the eighths for you, the ones that didn't reduce, so we have lines that are that long. If I then do the ones that reduce down to a quarter, we get lines, oops, that's the same color. Where's my green? There it is. Green, quarter, a quarter. And even if I grab those as well, okay, you'll notice that the notches or the lengths of the lines are all different. So you probably don't want to do this with yours. I'm going to use the dashed line here just to show my point. So the 16ths are that long. And down here on the ruler, they are the little short guys. Okay? So they are 16ths. Every notch represents a 16th. So if I go all the way over to 1 inch, there's a 16th. Now if I return back to my dashed line, the next layer, or the next length, is the eighths. So I'm just going to overwrite that in green then. So here's an eighth, here's an eighth, here's an eighth, an eighth, an eighth. So those lines are a little bit longer because they reduce down to 1/8. And finally, go back to my line, the 1/4 are longer yet because there's another layer of fractions. So it's kind of neat. So I'm just going to trace over the 1/4 now. So you see, okay, those increments, it gets longer, the larger the fraction or the more it gets reduced. So that's where those different increments come from, okay, on that imperial ruler. Okay, here's a conversion chart. You will want to keep this handy, all right, because it gives us all of the conversions, and I'm going to refer back to it not only in today's lesson, but in tomorrow's lesson as well. All right, so I want to keep it handy throughout the homework the first 2 days. So it just helps us with some conversions. So how do you do conversions? So 500 ounces to gallons. So this is the way I'm going to show you. Because you've done similar triangles at the start of the year, we're going to follow that pattern. So 500 ounces, you're going to write this as a fraction. 500 ounces over X gallons. And that's equal to, all right, so we're going to write 500 over X gallons. We don't know how many gallons. We're now going to go back to our handy conversion chart here, and we're going to look for the equivalent of ounces and gallons. So if I'm looking for ounces and gallons, we're looking at volume. And where are we here? Here's gallons. 1 gallon and here's ounces, is 128. So 128 ounces are in a gallon. So when I go back to this, I know that 128 ounces are in 1 gallon. Okay, now we're just using our skills from similar triangles and solving for x. Okay, so we'd flip the fraction. I'm going to get rid of the units now because the units are important in order to make sure my fraction lines up. Okay, so the whole reason I put those units in was to make sure everything matches. Ounces are on top, gallons are on the bottom. Now I'm just going to go ahead and I'm going to solve, I'm going to solve for x. And it's just using your skills from similar triangles. So how would I solve for x? Well, I flip the fraction. So x over 500 equals 1 over 128. Coming up here, I'm going to do a partial cross multiply because that would get my x by itself. So x equals 500 over 128, or x would equal, and just using your calculator, 500 divided by 128 gives me 3.9. All right, so if I have 500 ounces, I'm going to end up with 3.9 gallons. Okay, I'm going to, instead of rushing through, I'm going to finish this up in the next video, and it's just finishing up some conversions. And then you can go ahead and try some of the homework on your own.